So I'm giving you a slide lecture broken up into many sections that are going to show you the history of painting um, from really the beginning of time until now. And that sounds like a lot of images, and it is going to be a certain amount of images, but I'm going to show you major trends that happened in the development, in particular, of Western painting. Okay, so that means, European and American painting. And a lot of what is going on in the contemporary art world is based upon that tradition, okay, with some twists here and there. So this first image is the Chinese horse from Lascaux, the caves in Lascaux in France. It's dated at about 15,000 to 13,000 BC. So that's the BCE actually. So that's a long time ago, and you can see how elemental the idea of painting is to, civilization, human communication, right? Human expression. There are earlier examples of painting and drawing than there are of written language, for sure. Okay, so it is part of what makes us human, the idea of making images um, and painting. And in the terms of, this particular image, we don't really know what was the purpose of it. There are theories, but you can see that there's a fairly sophisticated degree of naturalism depicted here with the drawing, even though it's so long ago. So I think that, that idea, at the very least, you can say that the artist is trying to come to terms with the world around them, right? They're at the very least seeing an animal, and then the idea that you would want to be able to depict that animal in a two-dimensional format, I think is, a very, natural human impulse. Now we're jumping way ahead to a Roman wall painting. This is in the second style. This is from the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii. And you can see here, and this was painted, again, a long time ago. So it is 50 BCE. And you've got, again, some naturalistic depiction of form, for sure. The illusion of space is achieved through the overlap of the figures. The background, which is part of this particular era of painting for the Romans, is this solid sort of color. So maybe doesn't give you quite the illusion of depth that you would have otherwise, but certainly again, a fairly sophisticated degree of naturalism in their painted work, just as there is in their sculpture, which a lot more of sculpture exists from the Roman period and from the Greek period before this. There's not a lot of Greek painting in existence, classical Greek painting, that is. And so we don't really know to the extent that they practiced this sort of naturalistic drawing or painting or depiction, but we could theorize based on what they were doing with sculpture, right? And the reason why the sculpture exists is because obviously it's made out of bronze or marble, and it's very durable. And the reason why this still exists is because it was in something that had been sealed off by a volcano, basically. So otherwise, we might not still have it. This is painted as a fresco, so it's part of the wall. It's bonded to the wall, and that's another reason why we have an image this old, so like 50 BCE, but also Egyptian painting, for example. We have which are sealed off in tombs. Um, those are also fused with the wall in the fresco technique. So we get to see some of those images still. Okay, but with Greek images, those were out in the open air or in houses or whatever, and they just over time were lost to us. We do have some mosaics that were part of architecture that were theorized that they were part of or representations or copies of paintings that existed, but again, we don't know that for sure. When we are tested on this, all you're going to need to know is the era of the artwork. And the two images I've shown you, it's going to be really easy because anything that happens before the Renaissance, we're going to just say pre-Renaissance. So the caves in Lascaux, the Roman wall painting, pre-Renaissance. And this painting, also pre-Renaissance. This is the first one that you're really going to be required to remember because this is the first one where we know who the artist is. And the artist's name is Cimabue. And this is Madonna enthroned. And the medium here is tempera on wood. And I want to talk about these really formally. I'm not going to go too much into content, right? Or what it's supposed to be about, or the social significance of it. I mean, that's not really my area of expertise. What I look at is how it's put together. And in particular, as we're looking at these things, I want you to think about how the artist is depicting the illusion of space or depth, because that is going to be a common theme in Western painting up until we get to modernism, basically. So it's going to be a wide span where artists are getting better and better at depicting the illusion of depth. The critic Arthur C. Danto refers to this as the Vasarian narrative of Western painting. Giorgio Vasari was an artist in the time of the Renaissance, and he's also the first art historian. He's the first one that actually started writing about artists and what their art was about, and ranking them as to who's better than who. So he's really sort of the first art historian. But what's going on in here in this painting, Madonna enthroned by Cimabue, this is an altarpiece. Okay, so that's the purpose of this. It is to be used in a house of worship, and it is supposed to be something that is going to make you think about the Virgin Mary and Christ, certainly, and something that you could meditate on, perhaps, if in a spiritual context. But as we look at this, you're going to notice some strange things, I think, as far as a naturalistic depiction of form and space. Now, things that look like they are going to be more naturalistic, like the way that the drapery is depicted, for example. Some of these figures down here, these look like fairly realistic renderings of faces. Like they seem very specific in a way that these or even the face of the Virgin Mary isn't really specific, right? So you do have some modeling of form, mass, weight, and volume. That is happening in there. And you do have some attempt at depicting depth or space. You have this throne that she's sitting on that seems very sort of architectural, and it does look like that there is, to some degree, it is using perspective, though it isn't. Okay, it's using observed perspective, but it's not using what we would refer to as traditional linear perspective. And then you'll notice that even though these figures are closer to us, seemingly, because they're at the base of this throne that is closer to us than further back, these figures are smaller than the figure that's further back, the figure of the Virgin Mary. And that is because this is what is known as a hierarchy of scale. So scale, the people that are larger are the people that are more important. Okay, that's what's going on. So the people down here, these are saints, or these are people that are maybe perhaps members of the church, but they are not as important, obviously, as the Virgin Mary herself, the mother of the Savior, according to tradition, right? And you'll notice also in terms of space that you've got some overlap of form here, right? So you've got an angel in front of an angel, in front of another angel, in front of another angel. So whenever you have something in front of something else, that implies space or depth. And as you go higher on the picture plane, things that are higher read as being further back. This is referred to as tiering, as far as a design term goes. But when you do look at this, you'll notice that the angels, as they go back in space, don't get any smaller, right? Which they should. They should get, as they recede in space, they should get smaller, and the angel that's closest should be larger. So right there, that's sort of defeating the depiction of space. And then the other main thing that is making the illusion of space not really read is the color that he's chosen for the background, this gold leaf material, this reflective light surface, which actually comes to you, moves forward in space, doesn't recede in space, which is what you want to have happen in the background. And that is because it's not, Cimabue is not really thinking about showing you an illusion of depth. That's not really in his mind so much as what that color represents. So that color represents symbolically the kingdom of heaven, and that's why you see it being used oftentimes in these early Byzantine and pre-Renaissance icons and images, right? Because for what it symbolizes, the viewer at the time would understand immediately that this is the Virgin Mary based on her pose and based on the colors that she is wearing. Okay. That's a fairly standardized way of representing the Virgin, and it is something that you can't really diverge from. Like, you can't paint her in black and white stripes and red. That would probably land you in jail if you did that. If you did that and said that's the Virgin Mary, you probably would get into trouble, right? So there are certain standards that you sort of had to uphold, basically for the readability of the image, probably more than anything else. Because you have to understand that a lot of the people that would be viewing this are illiterate, so they get their understanding of their faith through what's told to them, orally, and reinforced visually in these images and statues, which are in Catholic churches. Now, that last painting, the Cimabue, is pre-Renaissance, and so is this. This is Giotto, and this is the Lamentation from the Arena Chapel. And this is a fresco, like the Roman wall painting was a fresco. But in here, you can see a little bit more a higher degree, let's say, of naturalism. Going back to the Cimabue, I did mention that these faces seem fairly specific and naturalistic, but the face of the Virgin seems very stylized. Like, you aren't going to run into a person that looks like this, most likely. So it's sort of idealized. These faces, not as much. Okay, there is some degree of stylization in them, but there is also some specificity to them as well. Now, you can see that it's not that sort of static, pose that you have in here, this very, what seems to be a pose. The figures here seem to be moving in a more natural way based on what's happening in here. So the lamentation, they're weeping over the body of the crucified Christ, right? So he's dead, and they're all upset about that. And their poses reflects that, or their pose reflects that. And you can see these sort of angels also very agitated in their movement, okay? Now, we also have going on in here stylistically, you've got this tree, which sort of is a stabilizing element because it is squared up to the edge of the image. And then you've also got this angle bringing you into the subject here, okay? So this is definitely a point of emphasis, and everybody is looking in that direction. And the figures are grouped to sort of emphasize that point of emphasis, right? And as far as space goes, the depiction of space, we're now using a color that makes more sense as far as depth. So you can see how this cool, more muted blue really does recede, and how these colors stand out or come towards you more, which is what you want to have happening. They still have the gold around their heads, okay? So these are halos. I had a student one time ask me in a college level class what these gold things were around their heads. And this was somebody who was not from a non-Western culture. So I was kind of shocked that they had never seen that before, but anyway. So those represent, the fact that these people are indeed saints, okay? That they're not just your normal mortals. Because you can see some of them don't have them, right? But one of the things that's kind of defeating this illusion of space is the way these angels are depicted. You can see that they're all sort of on one plane. They're not, you would expect to have, one angel closer to you and one angel further away, so that shifts in scale happening. Here they're all the same scale, as if they're, painted on a plane of glass or something. They don't really have a back and forward movement that you would expect in a naturalistic depiction of depth. Now this is the Renaissance. So this is where we can start to see that illusion of depth being effectively conveyed. And it's being effectively conveyed because the artist Masaccio is using this new tool of showing space, linear perspective, single point linear perspective. So you can follow the orthogonal edges of this barrel vault to a vanishing point somewhere around here. And that standard linear perspective that you all learned in your drawing one class, because if you didn't have drawing one and didn't learn that, you're going to have a heck of a time in this class, okay? It's an important rule that you really need to, not really a rule, but a tool that you're going to need to use and understand if you have any hope of depicting a naturalistic illusion of depth, okay, which will be required in a lot of the paintings that we're going to do. This is called the Holy Trinity fresco, and it's in Florence, and it is about 1428 is when it was made, and this is a fresco, right? Holy Trinity fresco. So we talked a little bit before about how a fresco is made. It's painted directly onto a wall, so it isn't an altarpiece like the Cimabue, which was a separate piece of wood. And that Cimabue, by the way, that's tempera on panel. So tempera, I don't know if you could hear that. That was my dog sneezing. There he goes again. So tempera on panel. Tempera paint, by the way, is pigment with an egg yolk binder. Okay, so that's what tempera is. It dries really, really fast. Okay, so it dries almost as soon as you put it down. So to get any kind of modeling or rendering of form, like what you see in here, you do it in the same way that you would do it with drawing, by making sort of hatching strokes. You get a gradation of value that way. With fresco, it's a little bit easier, but not really that much easier, because when you're painting, you're preparing the wall surface, with first a coat of stucco, and then on top of the stucco goes a layer of wet plaster. And then you're painting directly into the wet plaster. And once the plaster dries, the pigment fuses with that surface and it becomes part of the wall. That's why it's so durable, okay? But if you have any experience with plaster at all, you would know that plaster sets up relatively quickly. So we're talking 20 to 30 minutes, you have to work. So obviously the artist can't do one large painting like this, and this is quite large. These figures I think are about life size. So they can't do that all in one go. They have to do just one little area at a time. So an image like this would have had to have been gridded off, and then that grid translated into a larger gridded off image, and then working on each little square of the grid, one square at a time. So it's sort of painstaking in that way. But you are able to model a little bit easier than you can working wet into wet than you can with the tempera. I just didn't want to say about that. The perspective, the tool of perspective, was not invented by Masaccio. This is one of the first known examples of it. But just a dog off the couch. This is one of the first known examples of it. But he is not the person we think that sort of invented or developed the technique. That person is Filippo Brunelleschi, is who we think is the person that did this. Filippo Brunelleschi was not a painter. He was an architect, a metal worker, a sculptor. So he had other interests, and he was probably really good at math. So he developed this system because this was seen as a real problem in representation. Because artists were attempting to get more and more naturalistic in their depiction of form and space in painting. And the reason probably for that, why that happens at this time, the Renaissance, and when we say Renaissance, there's early, middle, and late Renaissance. You don't really need to worry about that. You just need to know, Renaissance. But the reason it happens in the Renaissance is because we start to see a development of commerce, really, where you've got a merchant class happening in Italy, and you've got people that are making money, and when money is being made, then there is construction going on, and when construction is going on, then there's digging, and when the digging happens, in Rome, you find things, okay, and in Italy. And so what they would find are these very extremely naturalistic depictions of human form in the form of Greek sculptures and Roman copies of Greek sculptures. And the artists of the, right before the Renaissance saw this high degree of naturalism, and they thought, oh my goodness, there seems to have been this lost skill that these artists had that we don't have access to anymore. And so there became this crisis of representation. Well, how are we going to get to that? Even though they didn't see examples of painting, they wanted to have that same degree of naturalism in their painting, right? So there were a lot of people that were sort of working on this problem. And then when Masaccio came up with this, or not Masaccio, when Brunelleschi came up with this idea, a lot of artists like Masaccio, and the artists you're about to see, really latched onto it because it really was a way of showing you this illusion of depth. The main factor to it, the thing that's the most important, is a fixed viewpoint. You are going to see examples of things that don't have that, and we can talk about that. But here we do. So a fixed viewpoint where you are looking in only one direction and your head is not moving, that is important to single point linear perspective. It's important to 2-point perspective as well. But that was the main innovation. Now that makes sense to us because we understand, if you think about like how would we get a naturalistic depiction of form in space, the way we're most likely to do it is to take a photograph of something, right? And that's a single viewpoint in time. Even a moving photograph, a moving image, is a series of single images, okay? So that's how it works. But Brunelleschi didn't have access to cameras, so he had no way of knowing that that was something that you needed. As humans, we can move through space. We could look anywhere we want, and we know exactly where we are in space. But if you look at a view of something from multiple viewpoints and try to put those multiple viewpoints onto one two-dimensional plane, you're going to end up with a very confusing space, okay? Which what later you're going to see in modernism by design. So this is still Renaissance, but this is the Northern Renaissance. So this is not the Italian Renaissance, and you can see that there in here there is a little bit something odd about the space, and that's because this artist Jan van Eyck is not aware yet of linear perspective, and if you follow the edges of things, like the floorboards, and then the windowsill, and the window frame at the top, if you follow those edges, you will find the back of the table that they do not converge at one single point. They don't. There's multiple eye levels here, and so that becomes really evident in the floor. The floor itself doesn't look quite like it's receding in space. It looks like it's actually a ramp that they're standing on. Okay, now that's one thing, but what he's really good at is showing you a likeness of a person. So this is the Arnolfini wedding portrait. I believe the official title is Giovanni Arnolfini and His Bride, painted in 1434. I have this written down. I don't know this off the top of my head, the date part, which is why I'm not making you remember any dates. So he does show you this, these people probably did look like this, okay? You can see really great rendering of textures, right? The fur of the hem of the coat, and the dog, and the wood, and the velvet, right? And you've got, this really beautiful brass chandelier, all that, great at that, depicting all those things. Even so much as having a convex mirror reflecting the scene in the room, right? A great depiction of light outside the window. So all those things he's really good at, but fusing them together into a believable space, not as strong. Now, this is the first example of an oil painting. So this painting is oil on panel. It's actually tempera first. So he would do a tempera underpainting and then paint on top of it with oil. Now, the advantage to oil, as you're going to find out as you're learning with it, and this is why you're learning with oil as opposed to learning with a different kind of paint, is that oil takes a long time to dry. It's a very slow process in drying. So with your paint staying wet, it stays workable, and it allows you to do blending, like the transition of the shadow into the light. It allows you to get those effects relatively easily, certainly more easily than you could in tempera by itself, right? Or other mediums that dry really fast. So that was why it was depicted. And the other thing you're going to notice with the oil painting is that there's a luminosity in the color, in a sort of a jewel-like effect of the color that you can really only achieve at this point in time with oil paints. And the color and the other things were seemingly a little bit more flat, right? The color here has a lot more depth to it. And that's because Jan van Eyck, when he's doing the tempera underpainting, he's doing that as a grisaille underpainting, a tonal underpainting, black and white or brown and white, so just values, and then glazing transparent color on top, a series of transparent colors on top. So that gives you this luminous quality. That's how that happens. And Jan van Eyck is one of the first people to be, he didn't invent oil paint, but he's one of the first people to really exploit the possibilities of it. And once, um, because I mentioned that merchant class, right? So these uh, paintings are usually relatively small um, and portable. And so this one is 32 inches high by 22 inches wide. So that's, movable. It's not part of a wall, right? So what happened was in Italy, you saw a lot of people buying these, and there was a trade in these in these panel paintings because of their portability, right? And so that does figure into the development of art. And certainly when Italians started seeing, oil painting and the effects that were possible, they were like, oh yeah, great. That's, if we can take that in our knowledge of perspective, all bets are off. We're going to be able to do, really great things. This is Sandro Botticelli. This is still Renaissance. Now, the thing about this is, by the way, also a tempera on canvas, which I wasn't really even aware was possible because tempera is a fairly brittle medium, and so canvas will flex. So if it is in fact on canvas, it would have to be a canvas that was stabilized by being stretched over wood or something. The thing that you need to understand about Renaissance painting, and the way that you know that it's Renaissance painting as opposed to another era, or if it is something that's trying to make a reference to Renaissance painting, which you will see later, is this sort of very logical way of composing. So balancing equal weight. So this is basically a symmetrical composition. We've got something right, Venus, right down the center, and then she's flanked by two figures over here and a single figure over here, but that single figure is taking up about as much space as the two figures together, right? So very logical, very balanced. And you'll also notice that the features of Venus and her body are quite stylized. And the reason for that is that because these Italian artists are thinking about antiquity. I mean, this is making a direct reference to antiquity, right? The painting, a couple of other paintings you saw before were biblical in subject, and this is what's known as a classical allegory. So, talking about the classical era, making reference to the classical era. Those were subjects of high art. The portrait was seen as a lesser classification of painting, but certainly, a master would do portraits for, commissions for money, right? But for an artist to be taken seriously, they would be doing these subjects that were sort of the subjects for fine artists. Now, in contemporary times, we think about the content of the work and what the work is going to be about, and that being sort of the choice of the artist. The artist doesn't really have that choice in this time, in the time of the Renaissance. The artist really can't do whatever they want. They have to do whatever they want within the context of certain norms, right? So that's why you're going to see these incremental changes, but you're not going to see radical changes until way later about content. The content is a given. So it's going to be a classical allegory. It's going to be a portrait. It's going to be a biblical scene. That's what it's going to be. And it's not going to be anything else. Okay. You're not going to see any Renaissance paintings talking about the plight of the working man or anything like that. You're not going to have content that is going to be outside of those areas I just mentioned. But, and because it is a hallmark of probably single point perspective, as we go back to this, you see with single point perspective, the emphasis on the horizontal, that's going to be very important, and the vertical. And anytime you are emphasizing the horizontal and the vertical, so the horizontal parallel to the bottom of the edge of the frame, and the vertical parallel to the edge of the vertical edge of the frame, that provides stability. That's rational. Stability is something that the Renaissance artist is trying to convey. So that equal visual weight that you see here in the Botticelli, and this horizontal axis providing stability, um, all that is important because the Renaissance artist believes that art needs to be better than nature. It shouldn't be simply a depiction of nature. You you have some degree of naturalism coming in to how they're painting figures, how they're rendering space, but they are also trying to make it idealized in the same way that the classical Greeks did. So this is sort of a classical tradition, a classical way of looking at things. So you'll hear people referring to the classical, usually the classical in opposition to, say, the romantic. Okay. So classical, rational, calm, stable, often mathematical. Okay. Those are the sort of the things to look at in how these paintings are put together. And really, in something like this. So this is Raphael, and this is also the Renaissance. And the by the way, when the slideshow is going to be available to you with all the names and all the notes, not a lot of notes. It's just going to have the names and the era and maybe dates. You know, maybe it'll even give you dimensions, right? So if you go to the pages section, you find the slideshow, you can click on that, and then if you view it in the thumbnail version, then it'll give you this information, so you can look that up for yourself. If you don't understand what I say with my mouth, you can read it. But anyway, this is Raphael, School of Athens. So he's, again, this is a classical allegory. He's talking about ancient Greece. He's depicting ancient Greece as best to his understanding, you know, with these classical statues in the niches, and definitely it's using single point perspective, so you can see that these edges are going to converge at a single point right about here. And he is talking about, you know, famous Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. That's who's in the center here. But you know, the figure of Plato is being depicted by a sort of a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, right? And this guy right here, I don't know who he's supposed to be, but I can tell you who he's modeled after. He's modeled after Michelangelo. I don't know who he's supposed to be in terms of that classical Greek. So all these figures are certain, like Pythagoras is in here, and, you know, people like that. All those people have relationship to this, to that classical, the ideal classical era, but they're being depicted by Renaissance artists because they're trying to make that connection between those two eras, that we are as they were. Okay. That's what this painting is about. Now, this is painted in fresco, so it's huge. So again, it had to be painted in and you know, the Sistine Chapels also, which you're not going to get to see. That's probably why Michelangelo is so disagreeable here, because I don't have that on my slideshow. The Sistine Chapel is a fresco as well, right? So that you can imagine what would be involved in making something that large in this particular method, in this technique. And another thing that you'll notice with fresco painting is that a lot of times the color is very vivid and very pastel-like. And the reason for that is because the color is mixing in with that layer of white plaster, right? So you do have this sort of pastel sort of version of that. Now, I mentioned the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is back to its original state where the color is similar to what you're seeing in here. But that's only fairly recently. I'd say within the last 15, 20 years that they got it back to that state. Before that, like in my memory, I was first studying art, or when I was a kid, you would always see that Sistine Chapel, and maybe you still see images like this, depicted in tones of brown without a lot of color, right? And that was because of all the layers of soot and pollution and candle smoke and all that stuff that had built up over the surface of the painting had made the color go away. Seemingly, it wasn't gone. It was just veiled by this layer of gunk, right? And they were always, they were afraid to do anything to it because they didn't want to damage the painting. And then somebody developed a technique to clean that surface so that you could get back to that color. And the funny thing was that when they did the first little test on the Sistine Chapel and saw the kind of vivid color that Michelangelo was using, they were taken aback and they paused and thought, should we even do this? Because we have become so used to this painting, the way we are looking at it now as all these brown tones, would it be too much of a shock to humanity to see it in the color the way that Michelangelo intended? And some art historians made the argument that yes, it would be too traumatic and to not do it. Okay, they had that as a reason, and other reasons too. They were worried also that if Michelangelo had done any kind of alteration to the fresco, on top of the fresco, that would be removed as well. We have no evidence that actually happened, other than at points in time when they painted fig leaves over genitals and things like that, which we wanted to remove those anyway because that was an original. So that was sort of the discussion, right? And luckily, the technology went out and they did restore it to what it was. Now, with School of Athens, formally, you can see this strong horizontal emphasis, right? And this very logical grouping. You've got these two figures in the middle of the painting, right? And you've got everybody sort of arrayed in a straight line across. So you've got these strong horizontal axes, and you've got the strong vertical axes, and they are all providing the stability that a good Renaissance painting needs. Okay? This is a Renaissance painting as well, and this is what happens when the Italians get their hands on oil paint. Okay, so this artist, there are a couple of people that are credited with this painting, so it's not 100% certain who actually painted the work, or if perhaps multiple people painted the work. So you are going to have to remember Giorgione. Giorgione is the artist here. But the other artist that gets credit for this oftentimes is Titian. Okay. And the reason for that is the system of painting at the time and how you would learn to become a painter in Renaissance Italy. What would happen is you would get yourself apprenticed to a master, and Titian and Giorgione were both apprenticed to Bellini, and they were working with Bellini and in his workshop. The way that worked, the way the system worked, was that usually you would be younger, so maybe 8 or 9. You would be a boy. You will be brought to the studio of the master, and you would be offered to the master as an apprentice, right? And the master would either take you on or not, depending. The idea was that the master would then train you in a skill, right? Like you could apprentice to be a metal worker as well, right? You didn't need to apprentice as a painter. So the master would take the young charge, and he would say, okay, so little Luigi here, you want to learn how to be an artist. Here's lesson number 1. here's a broom. I want you to go sweep out the studio. Okay. And here's lesson number two. This is how we clean my brushes. Okay. Um, this is how we light the stove to the studio. Basically, the master is getting a little slave, right? So that's the advantage to him. Okay. Um, the master then would say, okay, well, here's something to draw on. Here's something to draw with. Here, I'll set up this little plaster cast for you. You can see what you can do with that. See if you can copy that, if you can draw that. And, little Luigi would make a stab at it. And then the master would take a look at it and give him some pointers and shape him. First, learning how to draw. And then once he learned how to draw competently, teaching him how to paint. And he's not just doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He's doing this because he needs somebody to help him make the paintings. So oftentimes the master might just paint the figures, right? But the landscape in the background, that's boring. I don't want to do that. So, Luigi, you go take care of that. Okay. Paint the trees, paint the sky. I don't want to bother with that. And you might have more than one. Somebody might be a specialist in trees, somebody might be a specialist in architecture, whatever. So there's that. Okay, there's that component. And the reason he does that is because the master is going to make his money based on how many commissions he can get. And the more commissions he can punch out, the more more money he's going to make. So he needs to have sort of a factory-like atmosphere where they can put these things together. Now, the reason I fall on the side of Giorgione for this is called, by the way, Pastoral Symphony. And this is, as far as content goes, classical allegory. The reason I go with Giorgione is because you've got this profile which is very Giorgione-like, okay? The figures have a sort of, in the landscape, sort of have a Titian quality to them also. But it's because of that I fall on the side of Giorgione. Also, that's the way I learned it when I was in school. So I probably, it's an early bias I have. For what I always tell people to remember, if you want to remember Giorgione as the artist, you can think of it this way. Think about this guy here with the big afro, okay? And when you look at this guy, just remember that his name is Georgie. So his name is Georgie with the afro. So Georgie with the afro, Giorgione, okay? So that's how you're gonna remember. Now, as far as subject goes, you've got these women that are draped in the classical way. They're, semi-nude, nude figures with classical drapery sitting there, and you've got these clothed figures. And the clothed figures are wearing they're not wearing togas. It's not classical Greek costume in the way that it was, say, in the Raphael painting. That's contemporary clothing for the time that this was painted. So this is what people would have been walking around wearing at that time, okay? But it was still seen as this classical allegory. And so that's going to be something that's going to come up again later when we're talking about some later work. This idea of, making a reference to the classical, but also including sort of contemporary elements. Now, even though this is the Renaissance, if you can remember that this is the Renaissance in Venice as opposed to Florence or Rome, which is what the other artists were, that's going to be important because in Florence, you would see a more harder edge depiction of form, okay? In Venice, because Venice is, in the water, right? And you have that sort of ocean atmosphere around the city. So atmosphere becomes very important to the Venetian, or part of their lives, actually. So with the innovation with the Venetian Renaissance is you have this soft edge, almost as if the figures are emerging out of the atmosphere. You can see it here too, right? So that soft edge is called sfumato, and it is an innovation of the Venetian artists, okay, because of where they come from. And this is an oil painting, oil on canvas. And this is relatively small. It's not huge. So it's 48 inches, so 4 feet tall by about 66 inches. So it's not real big. And then this is going to be the last painting for today, and this is going to be something again that you're going to be called on to remember. This is Titian, and this is the Venus of Urbino. And it is Venetian Renaissance. And I want you to think about the composition here and the elements that make it a Renaissance composition, right? So you've got this strong emphasis on the horizontal, okay, for sure, providing stability and calm. You've got the emphasis on the vertical, also providing stability. You've got the logical composition, okay, so dividing really the space in half here, okay, equal. So this is basically a symmetrical composition, okay, symmetrical grid composition. Now, what's going on in this painting? You could probably come up with some theories, but it's called Venus of Urbino, and so that means that the subject it's a classical allegory again. Venus is the goddess of love, and that is what you would look at as being the content, but the subtext of the work is something different. Okay. Now, in Venice at the time, there existed something called the courtesan class. Okay. And the courtesan class was a very specific type of woman. In Venice at this time, if you were a female born into a good family, then your goal, your family's goal, was to get you married to somebody, a good provider, somebody who had an established household. So somebody likely to be about 35 or maybe older, but you as the female child would be, maybe 15, okay, maybe even younger, when you were betrothed, when you were married. And then you, the idea was that you, to do that, to be the woman of the house, you did not need to be overly educated, right? You needed to have a basic understanding of language and writing, okay, because you'd have to write letters and communicate, okay. And you would have to have a basic understanding of math and figures so that you could balance the books if you were called upon to do that, right, of the household. But that's about it. That's about all you needed to know. You needed to know how to take care of kids, okay? That was another thing. But you didn't really need to know much more than that. So your education didn't really go beyond those basics, right? But the courtesan was something a little bit different, okay? If you were a man of means, and you were going to go to one of the many festivals that would be going on in Venice, you wouldn't bring your wife with you. Your wife stays at home. Your wife is for you. Your wife isn't for public consumption, right? So your wife stays at home. She's got to take care of the kids. That's what she does. And you're going to go to your party or to your little festival with your courtesan. Okay, she would accompany you. And a courtesan is a woman that would be, normally beautiful and intelligent and educated. She might know um, theoretical math. She might know um, uh, music. She might know art. She might know philosophy. And the reason why she would need to know all that stuff is because um, you want her to perform well in conversation in these social situations. It reflects well on you. If your courtesan is somebody that um, is that intelligent, beautiful and intelligent, it makes you look better. So this is basically a portrait of a courtesan disguised as the goddess of love. Now, of course, this is a very sexual painting, right? You've got this completely undraped, nude female form, and her hand placed on her genitals, right? And in case that wasn't obvious, then you've got this line bringing your eye right down to that, okay? You've got that sort of come hither look on her face, right? So very sexy happening in here. And then the person that commissioned this is Ippolito di Medici, allegedly. And it's allegedly a portrait of Angela Zeffetta. Okay. And so Angela Zeffetta was documented as being a courtesan. Okay. The de Medici name would let you know that is somebody of noble birth. You probably heard that name before. They were a prominent family in Venice, and Ippolito actually was a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, not I don't think he was really happy about it, but his that was something that his family um, put him up to. In those days, the celibacy thing of the clergy was not such a thing. Okay, that so not only was he likely married, but also had a courtesan, right? So he certainly wasn't celibate. Now, the idea of this painting is that if this is in fact the courtesan, there's a couple of things symbolically that are going on in here, and you can see this little dog curled up on the bed. The little dog represents faithfulness. Okay, so what Titian is saying to Ippolito is that your courtesan, she is faithful only to you. She's only for you, only for your eyes. Okay. You can see obviously that she's well taken care of. She's well fed for sure. She's not starving, just based on the body type. And by the way, this is idealized feminine form. Okay, so this would be, the ideal female body type for this time. Okay, and it might be a little bit thicker than what we've come to expect in our idealized female body type, right? But if you think about like Renaissance Italy, if you were a woman and you were skinny, that probably meant that you were sick, okay? Or you were out working all day, right? So it did not show that you were of good birth for sure. You were certainly not desirable, okay? And she has the servants, right? So she's obviously well-to-do, and that's something that the courtesan class had access to. They would be put up in really nice quarters. They would be able to be educated. They would be able to go out to these festivals. They would eat well. They would, have fun. It was great to be a courtesan until you were no longer beautiful, right? So as you got older, then it was, a little bit more problematic. So the courtesans had to be wise in how they were handling the the wealth that they were getting while they were younger, if they had any hope of surviving. Okay. Now, I say that's the subtext of the painting. Okay. So the subtext is it's about a courtesan, it's about sex, it's about all those things. But because it's called the Venus of Urbino, it has sort of this higher minded ideal behind it. And so the person that owns the painting likely would have this hanging in his private quarters, okay, his study or whatever. Um, Usually someplace where he would be by himself. A lot of times a painting like this would have even been covered, if it was thought to be maybe a little bit indecent um, for other people to see, right? So it would have a curtain on it, and then the person who owned the painting could go into his private study and pull back the curtain and sit back and enjoy the painting, however he was to enjoy the painting. And should his wife walk in, he could say, what? No, this painting isn't about sex. What are you talking about? This is a classical allegory. This is high-minded stuff. This is not about sex, okay? So that's sort of why we've got these two sort of subjects happening simultaneously, okay? So again, Titian, Renaissance, okay? We're going to stop it here, and we are going to pick it up with the era that comes after this, which is the Baroque, okay? But everything that you've seen now is going to be either Renaissance or pre-Renaissance. All right.